All right, hello. My name is Elizabeth Hazen, and I'm really happy to be reading with Dora and Stephen today. I'm going to read poems from my new book, Girls Like Us, out from Allen Squire Publishing. And I'm going to start with the first poem in the collection. It's called Devices. Rhyme relies on repetition. Pink drink, big wig, tramp stamp, rank skank. Alliteration too. Peter Piper's pickled peppers, Silly Sally's sheep. Silly trumping smart because the L's create consonants. Assonance repeats vowel sounds. Hot bod, dumb slut, frigid bitch. Even his line, girl, will have a fine time, or her refusals, no, don't. In metaphor, we compare two things. Suppose a man calls a woman fox. We understand this is not literal. Same goes for pig, dog, chick. Same goes for octopus, as in, his hands were all over me. Metonymy relies on association. Suits, skirts, that joke about the dishwasher. If it stops working, slap the bitch. Synecdoche reduces a thing to a single part. He wants pussy, by which we must infer he wants a woman. We've been called so many things that we are not. We startle at the sound of our own names. So a lot of poems in this collection sort of have to do with I guess, identity and female identity in particular. So this is a poem about a, I guess, dysfunctional relationship and a little bit of alcoholism thrown in there. This is called Dictation. After days of heavy drinking, blackout is swift and total. Mexico, the moon so huge and blank, a hole of perfect darkness punched out. You wake up aching. Sand plasters your left ear. How like a doll you were. How yielding. I could have done anything I wanted. With a ragged fingernail, you scrape the sand that cakes your ear. Your thirst dictates silence. Anything I wanted. But I decided not to. Decisive. Incisive, he decided. And are you not the one who wanted him to stiffen up the drinks? Are you not the one who fell? But he decided. You practice arguments on your own body. A different voice repeating, unclamp your tongue. This is a poem called Death Valley. We took a lot of road trips when I was a child. So I spent a lot of time looking out of windows, sort of thinking. This is, Death Valley. My father grips the wheel. My mother reads a map in darkness. We are somewhere between Flagstaff and Antelope Canyon. I am somewhere between my brother and the wheel well. Jackrabbits play chase with our van, and I am out of breath. This morning, an invisible rattle shook, but we carried on through oceans of sagebrush and sand. Back home, cicada shells cling to bark. For weeks after our return, I will pluck the umber husks and string them like trophies to tie around my neck. On the window, I trace Elizabeth in the fog of my breath. By the time I reach the H, the E has disappeared. Sorry. Let's see, I think I'm gonna read maybe one poem from, this is my other book, Chaos Theories, also from Allen Squire Publishing. And some similar themes sort of were starting to emerge in this book. There's a lot of science in it too. This is called Meditation on Entropy. Tectonic plates are obvious shifters. Still, more is moving here. The sea erodes the shoreline, but that isn't what I mean. Consider grass, the way its roots alone must hold the yard in place, or the junk-filled creek bed drying up, the dying fire. Time moves in one direction. My son deploys toy soldiers. He's missing 2 front teeth. My worry lines will deepen, my nose expand. If I live long enough, I will have someone else's face. Already, I don't know myself. Living, a constant conversion, is confounded by this measuring. In the Earth's core, nuclei of radioactive elements decay. What I mean to say is this: instability prevails. Last week, I missed the exit home, but I drove on for miles in the wrong direction. Last year, I left my husband without warning. One could say I'm not myself, but I've been someone else before, and who's to judge if she was better? This is what I know. Energy turns to heat that seeps toward surfaces. Thermodynamics dictate that destruction keeps us warm. I did what I had to do. Death is indiscriminate, as you know already. The living make the same mistakes. The departed turn in their graves. Nightmares rack my son, but the static of my own bad dreams corrupts the standard line. You're safe, I lie to soothe his fears. Nothing can hurt you here. And I think I will read one more. This is the last poem in the book. It's called Monarch. And I wrote it shortly after moving in with my current husband, my second husband. I feel it's so funny saying that. And I guess it's sort of about, transforming from oneself into another, sort of transitioning, and how, we sort of leave parts of ourselves behind, but never entirely. So this is called Monarch. A monarch butterfly fallen from the air lay in a field. I took her home, pinned her to the wall above my desk. For 5 years, she was part of the scenery, like the teacup my son painted, or like the Post-it note you left once, slipping out before I woke. I love you, scrawled in Sharpie. I took for granted her orange rind stained glass wings, slanted bolts of black, the texture of velvet paintings, white spots along the edge like eyelets. I moved in with you gradually, a few boxes each weekend for months. I moved the Monarch toward the end in a frenzy of packing and lifting. I was careless with her, tossed her without thinking into a liquor box filled with books, the spine's uneven hazards. That she was mine to protect had not occurred to me before I opened the box to find the right wing torn. So all that was left was her body, the other wing, and orange flecks like confetti that I shook out over my empty desk, brushed into my palm, and let fall into the trash. I was certain she was beyond repair, but now that she's gone, I see her everywhere. Thank you.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Who's next? All right.
You want to read next? Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go next if that's okay. Hi everyone, I'm Stephen Leyva. I have a new book coming out in October, God willing, from Washington Writers Publishing House. And the book is called The Understudies Handbook. It was the winner of the Gene Feldman Poetry Prize 2020. So I'm really excited to share some poems from that book with you all. It has a lot of New Orleans in it, where I was born. Has some Baltimore in it too, and a lot about how we sort of engage with different roles that we're not allowed to play, how we put on and take off masks, are kind of the basics of the book. So I'm going to start with this poem called Ear Hustle. Can you all hear me okay? Sound is good? Okay, so ear hustle is like slang for eavesdropping. And so I think about like poems, you know, if I'm like translating Kant, you know, poems are like eavesdropping on the sublime. So this poem is called Ear Hustle. Get down to the smallest birthright I cannot claim. Say beignets, and doesn't the stutter of hot oil start to sizzle on the small plates of memory? Faces powdered with sugar, no thought to whose ancestors cut which cane, sing a hymn of Jackson Square hangs its portraits on the iron gates, and who can hold a horn note as long as the midday sun? Look up from that small plate in Cafe Olé and see the bent levees of language I cannot break. I will shame every shibboleth, and every house is lifted like a paused rapture. This cruelty and more fries the Godhead in lard. Pour me a cup of chicory. A saxophone player cuts a canal through the breakfast den, playing Tank in the Bangers. I gotta make a quick decision about how often I can be rescued. Neither I nor my children will ever ride the roller coasters at Jazzland, where a sign still hangs as it does in the heavens, will open after storm. So there are two poems in this manuscript that have the title Creolite. So I'm going to read the first one of those, Creolite 1. Creolite 1. Mist on the marshlands of the tongue. Here we say stow and flow, rhyme, contrarians. Born into the family of auto-anonyms, we cleave any countersign, any accent, bolt to the speakeasy door. Do you belong? Candor. Born in a basket of idiom. Go down, Moses, cleave the sea that first taught us neither its great hexameters or its plain I ams. Low tide, low parish, low chariot, swing and swing, carry us, lightning. Help us to conjure another homeland. The most specific pain of exile is boredom, heavy as the humidity which always hangs like a carcass of wind in Louisiana. The earth inside your skull, America across your face, the South chapping your lips, mist on the tongue's marshlands. Here's another poem. I think all three of us in the reading are parents. So here's a poem called How Our Sons Learn to Fight. How Our Sons Learn to Fight. The same chest-thumping tableau of two men disrobed and so close their fears thin to apple skin. We ain't hear nothing. Drum kit. We forget whose breath broke the silence. In the dark, can anyone tell one groan from another? The angels or Jacob's or the subwoofer praying hard to our knees, which fall and rise unrepentant to the parquet floor? The punch bowl gloriously shatters, slapped with strobe light. Our bodies remember our fathers saying, throw the first fist and buck. We remember we invented our fathers, advice about how to fight another man, because we did not know how to begin a love, only how to bruise the end. There's a poem that I read every time that I do a reading called Supremacy. And part of the reason why I read it is that it's built heavily on metaphor, and I think that metaphor is one thing that ties us all together. Supremacy. Consider the shuttlecock, its deft lightness, its rubber nose unbent, its attention to racket, its fear of the ground, its willingness to lob or smash its whiteness, its penchant for being held aloft by the slightest breeze and histories of swing, how it needs to be batted between two players, how it recognizes their want, Consider its feathers, its plastic, its conical shape suggesting hierarchy, and always its weight in your hand, how it seeks to be served. All right, I'm just gonna do two more short ones. This one is called Ode to Lando Calrissian. I write a lot of nerdy poems about nerdy things, and so I wanted to include that because that's part of what the manuscript does too. Ode to Lando Calrissian. If you were stunting in a galaxy far, far away, blue cape, suave with a gold lining that would shame the sun, with a cool walk and a gambler hustle. If you had a hairstyle so fresh, you'd claim to have won it off an out-of-work Cloud City cosmetologist. If even your eyebrows had scoundrel in their arch. If everybody knew the music bumped cargo hold to cockpit in the Millennium Falcon, a name straight out of P-Funk. If everyone could see the hands churning the dark dream of stars into the buttermilk of a hip brother running his own city. If we asked, where are all the Black people in the galaxy? Would you help us? Would you bet on us? And so I'm going to end with what's something of a bit of a love poem. It's called Anti-Confessional 3. This isn't a secret. I have failed to love with the patience of hibiscus root, whose buds bloom with no thought of being tea. I have not loved my innocence, overdressed in morning light. How can the earth keep turning to the thing that will kill it? Oh, sun, bring me a warm hill in August, an echo of a fragile and immortal green, a better remembrance of my grandma's eyes. I have failed to forget love is one of many higher choruses. And yes, there are octaves of light that linger. Can we still call love love anymore? Or have we avoided failure? Every ode must fail if there is to be a higher love.
That was so beautiful. Thank you. This is so great to read with both of you. Stephen, I can't wait to read your book when it comes out. And Liz, as you know, I always love to read your work when it comes out. So I'm so excited that the new book is out. I'm Dora Malech. I'm reading from my newest book, which is called Flourish, and it just came out from Carnegie Mellon University Press. And I'm going to read a couple poems straight from the beginning and then flip to the end. The first one is called Party Games, and it starts with an epigraph from Andrew Joran, Might Night Right Sight. The first thing she did after we blindfolded her and turned her in circles by her shoulders was lunge for where she thought her target hung and hit tree trunk instead. With one strike against it, split the stick in half to jagged dagger in her fists. The donkey gently swayed within reach, barely grazed and staring straight ahead with the conviction inherent to its kind at the horizon that a gaze implies. Paper mane fluttering in the breeze of a near miss, belly ballasted with melting chocolate kisses, drawn grin belying its thingness, rictus of ritual and craft. She's grinning too and laughing, regaining her balance, planting her feet in a samurai stance. She brandishes her splinter. There's no harm in letting her take another turn without turning her around again. We think we know how this ends, how good it feels to play at this. Violence and darkness, the beast that harbors something sweet. Country songs. I wish I could write a real country song, but I can't, so this is what I've got. Country song. My man does his crying on a fast horse. I do my best dancing with strangers. The child screams through the moment of silent prayer, says, it's a free country, says, you and what army? You can't trespass on a river. You're only in the wrong when you step out of it into this field. All false hopes translate to just beginnings. There was no grace of God. I went. No secret that the sun and moon have always slept in separate beds. Gives some steel, steals some time and calls it borrowed. Bruises and calls it something blue. A red bird, a yellow bird, not in the same hour's frame, but close enough for their color together to make a kind of ringing. I thought he brought the water from the spring, but he's still bringing. I delegated. My job is waiting, is drinking water. I'm learning to say, it's a free country, this army, but not me. Lake Roland Park. So for those of us who live in Baltimore, we probably all know that what's now called Lake Roland Park was for a long time called Robert E. Lee Park. So this is Lake Roland Park, and the date on it is 2016. Lilacs, mown grass, and the scent of my own soap rising from the back of my neck in the heat. The train downtown sighs by beyond the trees. A minute later, the train into the county looks the other way. Fancy all these flowers opening to mouth their truest names. In a notebook from last spring, I don't want Robert E. Lee Park to be this pretty. It's spring again now, Earth's orchestra pit swelling into green strains, vernal reprise. In between, nominal reprieve. In the fall, executives announced the park's new name, which had long been the name of the reservoir itself, actually, at the groundbreaking for a new nature center. Ceremonial photo opportunity with hard hats, shovels, smiles. Replaced. I visited the park for the first time last May, the month after what the city calls alternately the riots, the unrest, the uprising. The bill to rename was introduced last summer, later, following the Charleston shooting. I can't hear it, but there's music all around me, literally. Everyone walking and jogging past wears headphones, earbuds. Imagine hooks and bass lines, melodies unheard except for self-selecting audiences of one by one. Saying a things still slippery as the stones in the stream bed of Roland run. To say that we are listening is not to say that these are hearings, though there are hearings. Skipping forward a little bit here. This poem is called Each Year, and it's another spring poem. Each year. Each year I snap the twig to try to trap the springing, and I relearn the same lesson. You cannot make a keepsake of this season. Your heart's not the source of that sort of sap, lacks what it takes to fuel, rejects the graft, though for a moment it's your guilty fist that's flowering. You're no good host to this extremity that points now broken, back at the dirt as if to ask, are we there yet? You flatter this small turn tip of a larger book of matches that can't refuse its end, refuse itself, unflare. Sure, now forget again. Here's a new green vein, another clutch to take, give a handful of seconds. And the last poem that I'll read is the title poem, which is called Flourish. Flourish. Clematis, sweet pea, sweet alyssum, sweet asylum, adornments adamant, heaven sent to bed an arbor's ardor. Trellises, yes, this reaching toward its own reward. Sweet re-aching might redeem what seems a frail unfurling to refuge instead. Re-fugue played in contrapuntal context shows some pragmatist's thanks, thriving not only as noun and verb, but stem, climbing aster and hydrangea, honeysuckle, wisteria, twine and tendril reaching skyward toward, as if to pick a warden's lock, as if jazz hands, spirit fingers, fireworks, as our shared shards glitter on this floodlit stage left empty, and the river rising like ovation, out of whose rush and rake and raise and refuse grows again these petals, pleats, sequins, pirouettes, curtsies, and cleag-eyed bowers. Sure-fired lines run to sun's stunning statement piece, peels on which an hour slips under the higher wire and over the big top we make of what's at stake. Tensile tendrils, corkscrewing up to pour more sunlight. Celebrate the act we make of the temporary fact of us. Thank you.
I've got a couple of things that I can kind of toss out there to start off the Q&A, because I was reading some of the poems, some of all of your poems, in preparation for this. So, one of the things that I thought was, if you don't mind, I mean, we can start it that way if that's okay with
Yeah, that's great.
So one of the things that sort of struck me, Liz, I'm thinking of your poem, Devices, that you read. And then Dora, I'm thinking of an old poem of yours from Shore Ordered Ocean called Aleph Bet, in which language, there's a very meta writing about what poems and words are doing, both in the world and within the poem. And I hear it very much in the tradition of Brenda Shaughnessy and Kay Ryan. Sometimes we say wordplay, but sometimes that can be a little reductive. So I wonder if you could talk about the way that you're using sometimes meta commentary or meta, maybe you don't even think about it that way, but the way that you're letting language turn on itself in order to arrive at something new in your poems.
It's interesting you should say that, Stephen, because I was thinking of that with speech in your poem, Creolite, the one that you read today. And there's a sense of the way we say it makes it the way it is, the two words that in a different mouth wouldn't rhyme. I think, I don't want to say it's not a cult necessarily, but taking the materials of language and finding meaning in them that's overlooked every day, I think seems like it's really generative for all of us.
Yeah, definitely. I feel making it new or looking at language in a new way is sort of our job, or part of our job.
Yeah, I always find it as poets should be nerdy about language in that way, so these types of poems should show up. But yeah, it's funny that that Creolite one, essentially I wrote that as a new poem for the manuscript, which was different than what I turned in. And I might as well have put it, after Liz Hazen, after Dora Malech, because I definitely had your poems in my mind writing this, even though there are other, Creolite poems in the manuscript. So yeah, I see it primarily as a nerdy endeavor. And so sometimes I wonder how much that translates to people who have different relationships with language. You could, if you start because for me, it's I'm on my Wu-Tang shit. I'm on my really kind of intersectional stuff when I'm thinking about that. And I'm not always sure how that how that resonates with different kinds of readers.
I mean, I think it really does. And I think like listening to your work, there's just such pleasure in making those connections. In that poem, I mean, that poem feels really celebratory, obviously in the face of adversity. And then it's interesting because, you know, when people talk about wordplay, like you're saying, it can get this kind of bad rap as like, oh, it's sort of like a one-trick thing. But then you think how dark it plays in Liz's poem about the different like figurative language and metonymy and metaphor. And I mean, that's like a very chilling poem that you get so lost in this sort of like very cold deployment of this lesson in objectification that you know, it just sort of listening to those two poems together from two different poets kind of shows the range of what that kind of play can do, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that line in Liz's poem. You know, his hands were all over me. Metonymy relies on association, suits, skirts, that joke. I mean, it's like that really like cuts to the core of both language and language's power within like a body, right? Within an identity.
So
yeah, our tools are just words, right? So it's like got to kind of plumb them as much as we can, or something. Dora, I feel like your work, you do a lot of that. And yeah, wordplay maybe isn't the right word, but I mean, looking at words themselves, and they become like so much more to them that we kind of overlook ordinarily. And I don't know, I love that. It's just, you know, I'm constantly like writing down words that have multiple, possible meanings, and just, I don't know, it's sort of a lens through which we can look at bigger issues. I think, I don't know.
And to me, I mean, you know, sometimes people will ask the question, like, is every poem political? And, you know, and I mean, I think the answer is yes, in a way. I think there are some poems that are doing more specific, explicit political work, which is important. But so, you know, it's maybe a cop-out to think every single poem is equally political. But that said, I do think the idea of paying attention to what we don't pay attention to every day, you know, and putting that kind of pressure on language, I think can have an inherently like social or political component to say, look at this thing that you overlook every day and you use every day, but you don't recognize it.
No, that's a really good point. I feel like actually, Stephen, maybe you were asking for, you know, who's interested in that. And I feel like that's becoming something that more people are interested in, sort of just looking at, I don't know, the way we use language, the way we address people, the terms we use for ourselves and for others, in the way, you know, I mean, language is identifying things, but it's also creating things.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. You know, it's what I often say is like the battleground is language, right? Like you can't really wound me in reality till you've already wounded me in language. You can't dehumanize me until you've already dehumanized me in language, right? Like, so it starts, you know, it matters what you call a thing, right? Like, to quote another poet, right? Like that sort of ethos, I think, is kind of embedded in what we're talking about, and that, you know, when you start to like, you know, get into the grist and gristle of language, you're going to arrive at political concerns. But, you know, what's funny about it though, too, is if you asked me about process, I would say that it's wordplay. I would say that what I began with was a very deep, imaginative sandbox of play, right? But what I don't mean is that I've somehow entered into the realm that some language poets arrive at, in which I'm like actively trying to connect to something important, like meaning, right? I'm not trying to subvert myself, you know. I'm trying to find something to surprise myself, and then hope, you know, that the reader is surprised as well. And so, you know, I'm kind of with all of you on that sort of, you know, like when people ask that question about is a poem political or anything like that, it's like saying water is wet. You know,
well, anytime you say anything, it's you know,
we live in the politic, you know, but but that's not a satisfying answer, because the question that's being asked is actually something else, right? It's a kind of sublimated thing. It's really as if a person is really saying something like, you know, am I going to enjoy this message? You know, and I can't answer that question. You know what I mean? Like that's, and I could be projecting a little bit, but that's the question underneath the question that I hear is one of am I going to enjoy this art? And I'm all like, well, you know, yeah, you are. You know?
Right.
I mean,
Well, I mean, I think also when you think about, I don't know, words and kind of word play, it's like there is, I would think for all of us, tremendous pleasure in just playing around with language and the music of language and puns, I mean, you know, and just multiple meaning. I mean, and some of it is play, and I think there has to be pleasure in the process of creating whatever it is we're doing, however serious the message might be, because, you know, why else do we keep doing it? I mean, ultimately, it's like, when I get into it and I forget about everything else and I'm just focusing on particular words and their relationship to each other or whatever it is, that's when I can forget about everything else.
Which thing, because for me, so much of writing is that like losing yourself in language, and then maybe in revision, you're sort of figuring out what you wanted to say. So Stephen, when you were talking about writing Creolite 1 sort of toward your manuscript, I know all of us just put these new books together. And that to me was really interesting to think of like, what would lead you to be able to be in a way that clear about what's something that the book needs at this point to finish itself. So would you, I mean, where were you in the process? Like, can you talk a little bit about how the book kind of took shape?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about that particular thing in particular, or that, you know, so essentially I got a note from my press, and I don't think they'll be mad at me, you know, saying it. So Washington Writers Publishing House is a co-op. So everyone who is published on the press is also, they're also editors on the press. So there's a lot of like community and collective feedback. And a couple of things that were happening in the manuscript were things like, you've got a poem here called Creolite 2, but you don't have a poem called Creolite 1. And I know for me, it was like, well, that's because, you know, I wrote a Creolite 1 and that joint was, you know, trash. And so I didn't include it. I didn't include that in the manuscript. But then that, instead of like trying to resolve that note or that dissonance about why, you know, that why is there something listed out of order, essentially, my response was simply to write a new poem towards something that the manuscript was trying to handle. And you know, I could, if I showed it to you all, it would look like a kind of Wanda Coleman style American sonnet, right? It's just wild. It tries to echo some of the other things that are being said in the book. There's a lot of poems where the word tongue shows up in the poem, whether as meaning a speech or something religious or something about the way that you can tell that, you know, the mask of accent, right? I know you're from a place because I can recognize, you know, your shibboleth, right? So it was really kind of to try to satisfy a note, a bit of feedback, right? But then when I got into it, I was like, oh, you know, maybe there's something that I've been trying to say with other poems that haven't gotten there really clearly, that this note about why is there something out of order gives me an opportunity to address. So, I mean, I came at it very circularly, but you know, it was definitely hard, because once you turn in the manuscript, I was like, you know, I've been working on this for 7 years. Do I really feel like writing another poem? But you know, I want the book to be as good as possible, so you do the work.
Yeah. Liz, how did your manuscript come together? I mean, did you know sort of thematically, because it feels really coherent
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think, yeah, like the first book, it was written over probably 10 years, and there was some coherence to it, but also because it was so spread out over time, it feels really different, I think. And this one, you know, a lot of the poems were written in the early Trump administration. So that was background noise. And I think all of the conversation around the Me Too movement and all of this just really like got me, I don't know, just entered my brain. And so whether it was consciously or unconsciously, a lot of the poems ended up being related to sort of female identity. And, you know, I recognized that pretty early on. And so I think I wasn't writing toward that, but it was just as I was writing, I was aware that that was something that I was exploring. And so I do think, you know, a lot of the work focuses on that. Some of them are really old poems that I went back and essentially took like a seed of it and just completely rewrote them with this new idea in mind that helped give me, I don't know, some focus that I didn't have before. So like the poem I read, Death Valley, that was something I tried to write, you know, 15 years ago about that experience of writing in the car, but I don't know what it was about. And somehow through this, putting together this manuscript and looking at some of the old work, it was like, oh, you know, this poem is actually about like sort of having no sense of self and sort of just being really passive in my own experience. And it seemed like it kind of connected in that way. So I was a lot more intentional, I guess, about putting
it's so
together.
interesting to recontextualize an old draft and like have it then make meaning for you. I love that.
Yeah, I know, it was nice. It was like, oh, I don't want to lose the, you know, like that experience. I know I want to write about that. I know there's a poem in there, and there's a few that ended up in this collection that were really, really old poems. Some of the ones about, you know, childhood stuff, because when I initially wrote them, it was not at that time really clear to me what it was I was trying to figure out. And yeah, so I mean, that's what the process was for this. But what about you? Because you have 3 collections, and I wonder, was it a really different process for each of them, or?
So this is, well, it's funny. My collections, each time, and I hope this doesn't happen again, because it's weird. Each time I thought I was writing one book, and then it turned out to be 2 unwieldy books that I had to like conjoin from each other. So with Short Ordered Ocean and Say So, it was all sort of one manuscript, and then I really started realizing that there was a more outward-looking thread and a more inward-looking thread. A lot of the poems in Short Ordered Ocean were sort of characterized by like thinking about distance and travel and the political. And so those kind of came together then. And Say So is that the language is a lot denser, it's much more playful, and it's much more thinking about interpersonal relationships. So I ended up extricating them that way. And then I was like, well, I'll never make that mistake again of not recognizing 2 manuscripts. And so then like the next 10 years, I was like, why is this manuscript not working? And then it was the same thing where a book that came out in 2018 called Stet was all really working around this kind of formal experimentation, often like using the anagram and kind of really going to like the farthest extreme of the kind of play that we were talking about dismantling language and putting it back together. And that ended up, I sort of thought that it would be like a thread within a book of more quote unquote traditional poems, but it kind of needed its own room to breathe. And so that became that book, which really allowed me to think about Flourish more thematically. And you were saying that, you know, a lot of the poems came together during the Trump administration. You know, the date 2016 sort of appears a couple of times in this book as a kind of high watermark, not in a good way, of a lot of the kind of currents of violence that like, you know, cultural violence that were running through the book. And so it kind of found its form there. But of course the title Flourish, a lot of it has to do with sort of finding ways personally, culturally, to thrive in the midst of some of these forces that are shaping the culture.
Yeah. How did that affect the way, like the texture of your lines? You know, they become more imagistic? Did they become more direct? You know, like I'm thinking of like somebody like Brenda Shaughnessy again, who has like all this wordplay, and then in Our Andromeda you get to the title poem, and it's just like hard hitting, direct. This is what happened with Cal. You know, like just kind of leaves you on the floor. So I'm curious about that sort of evolution at the level of syntax, at the level of line,
So,
as you move through those different books.
thank you. Yeah, I think for me, in each one I was trying to do something with the book that the other one maybe couldn't entirely do. And so I think that the book that came out 2018, Stet, and this one, Flourish, I think I went even further with that, where because one was so invested in the kind of materials of language, this other one, Flourish, that came out, I really tried to like push toward other strengths and possibilities of what language can do. I still don't get away from wordplay because it's too pleasurable for me and too generative, but these poems, a lot of them are longer, a lot of them are more narrative, they're more imagistic, they're just kind of relying on like a slightly different toolbox in what they're doing. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that like one, and I'm sure this is the same with you know, one project or even one poem kind of ricochets you off into whatever the next one is, sort of saying, okay, well, if this can do this, what's missing is this, and then kind of trying to like keep yourself honest and push in a different direction.
So can I ask you all about, both of you, about love poems? So you each have a poem that's the title, right? The title is Love Poem. But those poems couldn't be more different in terms of how they approach that idea. And you know, maybe I'm sort of hopelessly romantic, but I'm often like interested in how poets address the type of poem that people say is hard to write. You know, that it's hard to write a love poem and have it feel vibrant, and yet, you know, like we be doing that shit all the time. like we just don't always publish them all, right? We just don't always like show them. So I was curious if both of you could talk about how you approached either those particular poems or the idea of a love poem in general.
I mean, I think, yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I just live in dread of the sentimental, and I think I have a lot of trouble with them. So I know, yeah, which poem you're talking about, because I think there's only a couple poems that sort of portray relationships in a positive way, but I felt like I needed that voice in the book somewhere, because there's so much about dysfunction, and it is true that, I mean, I think for me, it's like the feeling of love, and what I'd want to portray in a love poem is kind of like a sense of calm and peace, and that's hard for me, it's hard to capture that. I mean, I've tried, yeah, I've tried a bunch of times, and I don't know how well they turn out. I mean, it's also like, I don't know, I think I'm what's the word, superstitious or something, you know, worried that if I put this into words and try to capture something so positive, am I gonna jinx it or lose it or something? So I don't know. I power to the people who can, yeah, write love poems effectively. I think it's really hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think any sort of like genre of poem that has that much like weight of history. I mean, so many of our favorite poems and anthologized poems are love poems, and so I think there's that pressure there. But I also think that anytime there's like a taboo or moratorium on anything in writing, it kind of makes me want to do it more. Like, oh, you can't write about love, or you can't write about the moon, or, you know, whatever it is. The latest one that I've been thinking about a lot is sort of skepticism about writing poems about children. And I, you know, we were talking about us all being parents. I mean, that's something that I think, Liz, we were talking about fear of being maudlin. I think there's like even more risk there than
With
like
kid,
a love poem between adults, because you just, it's so seeped in sentiment, like by its
right. It's just precious. There's something precious about it. And
yeah.
So careful.
Which of course makes me want to try it, because I'm
yeah.
you know, well, who says we can't do that, or who says it's going to be sentimental?
Right. Good for you. Yeah.
Yeah. There's, I mean, on that particular topic of writing about children, you know, sometimes I'm like, well, you know, yes, there's a risk of sentimentality. But I think about William Stafford saying, you know, if we aren't risking sentimentality, we're not close to our true voice.
Right.
So it's like, I want to get up to that line and not cross over it. But I think often, and I'll just speak for myself, I think often poets who are parents write about their children sometimes in ways that make themselves uncomfortable, and then don't publish those things, you know, like, so it's like, if I published all the things or ways in which my children come into a poem, you know, I might also have to grapple with that cognitive dissonance about how I'm appearing to the public as a parent. When, you know, so, but I can tell you for a fact, you know, just like all cards on the table, I remember when my son was born, and, you know, I was, you know, me and my partner were in the apartment, you know, together, and we were caring for him. And I was like, this is the most stressful thing I had ever endured. And the thought that entered my, yeah, seriously, but the thought that entered my mind was, yeah, the thought that entered my mind is, I understand why people hurt their children. And it wasn't me saying that I wanted
you have to write that poem. Have you written that poem?
Oh God, no, of course not.
You gotta write that poem.
But that's what I'm saying. I mean,
yeah.
But in some ways, what I'm saying is I'm always writing that kind of poem, you know, kind of like circularly, because maybe I'm not willing to risk the kind of sentiment that's a different kind of sentiment, right? That's happening there. But you know, it's you know, I think if I took, I mean, it's one of those things. It's like, we have tons of poems about love that are really just the loss of love, right? And how many of them are actually about love fulfilled, you know? You're putting Neruda to the side, his self, you know? And it's the same thing about like parenting. It's like we probably have a lot of celebratory poems about children, but how many of them are about the aspects that might be in conflict with one another when it comes to that? You know, it's that kind of stuff. Like, you know, I don't want to call it confessional, because, you know, I mean, maybe that's what it is, but
that's the tension that makes it interesting.
Yeah.
But I also, I mean, I don't know about you all, but I grew up with my brother, who's like really gregarious and really like affable. And like in my family, all the men are extroverts except for me. And so I got like sick when he would like be in church or someplace and telling stories, and I was always in the story. I was like, my brother's name is Rabu. I was like, leave me out of your sermons. Please leave me out of your storytelling. And so I think about that sometimes when it comes to like putting a child in a poem. It's like the same sort of concern about, do I want to put their face on the internet? You know,
right.
It might live forever.
And it does, I think, with anybody, but with kids especially, raises questions of consent. And I think there's kind of a double sensitivity there for sure.
Yeah.
You guys think we're good here?
Yeah, I think so. This was fun. Thank you all.
I know. You guys are.
Yeah, it was a lot of good.
Yeah. Stephen, I know that Ivy wants to reschedule, and I feel like Dora, I don't know.
Yeah, I hope we can reschedule for the fall or something like that. Yeah.
I know. It's like.
Stephen, when is your book out? Remind me.
October 15th is the release date, which is three days before my birthday. So how about that, right?
That's great.
Cool.
You know, hopefully we will no longer be,
Oh my
you know,
God, don't
quarantined with
even
the
like,
Rona,
Please, please.
you know,
6 months away.
but I don't know. I really don't know. Like,
Oh my God.
I'm trying to be optimistic about it all, but, you know, yeah, I want to reschedule if we can reschedule those readings, but who knows? I mean, we
Who
really
knows,
don't know.
right? Who
Yeah.
knows what will happen? Well, thank you guys so much for doing this.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
really like your books. Everybody buy their books. Buy Liz Hazen's
I know,
book.
I gotta get Dora's.
Girls Like Us, buy that book.
Yeah.
Buy Flourish by Dora Malech.
Instead,
And we'll cop those. Yeah, get them.
Awesome.
All right, thanks,
Take
guys.
care, everyone. Stay healthy. Bye.
Bye.